The bitter February wind cut across the Colorado territory like a scythe through wheat, carrying with it the promise of death for any soul foolish enough to be caught in the open. Sheriff Adam Collins pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as his horse, Chester, picked his way carefully along the snow-packed trail that marked the northern boundary of his jurisdiction. The storm had passed 2 days ago, but its legacy remained, drifts reaching as high as a man's chest and a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. Adam had been sheriff of Millfield County for 6 years, long enough to know that winter claimed more lives than outlaws ever did. Every spring brought the grim discoveries. Prospectors who'd ventured too far from shelter, travelers who'd misjudged the distance between way stations, families who'd simply run out of food and fuel during the endless months when the mountains became impassable barriers. He was making this patrol against the advice of Doc Morrison and half the townspeople, but something had driven him out into the frozen wasteland, a restlessness that had plagued him since the storm began. Maybe it was the letter from his sister back in Missouri, asking again when he'd give up this dangerous nonsense and return to civilization. Or maybe it was the dream that had woken him for 3 straight nights, a woman's voice calling for help through the howling wind. Chester snorted and shied sideways, his breath creating clouds of vapor in the Arctic air. Adam tightened his grip on the reins, scanning the white expanse ahead for whatever had spooked his usually steady mount. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his words instantly swallowed by the vast silence. "What is it?" Then he saw it, a dark shape against the pristine snow, perhaps 50 yards off the main trail. At first glance, it looked like a fallen tree or perhaps the carcass of some unlucky deer. But there was something about the form that made Adam's pulse quicken with dread. He urged Chester forward, the horse's hooves crunching through the crusted snow with deliberate care. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into something that made Adam's stomach clench with a mixture of horror and desperate hope. A woman lay crumpled in the snow, her dark hair fanned out like spilled ink against the white ground. She was curled in on herself, her arms wrapped protectively around something, and from that something came the thin, reedy cry of an infant. "Christ Almighty!" Adam breathed, swinging down from the saddle so quickly he nearly lost his footing in the deep snow. The woman was dressed in a thin cotton dress that would have been inadequate for a spring evening, let alone a Colorado blizzard. Her lips were blue-black, her skin the color of old parchment, and frost had formed in her eyelashes and along her hairline. Every instinct told him he was looking at a corpse, but the baby was alive, somehow still alive, pressed against her chest beneath the inadequate folds of a worn shawl. Adam dropped to his knees beside them, pulling off his gloves to check for signs of life. The woman's skin was ice-cold to the touch, but when he pressed his fingers to her throat, he felt it, a pulse so faint and irregular it was barely there, but unmistakably real. "Ma'am?" he called, though he didn't expect a response. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Nothing. But the baby's cries grew stronger, more insistent, as if the child sensed rescue was at hand. Adam made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He gathered the woman carefully in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, too light, as if the cold had leached the very substance from her bones. The baby, a tiny thing with a red, wrinkled face and lungs that worked with remarkable vigor, was bundled against her chest so tightly that Adam had to work to separate them. "Shoo, little one," he murmured to the infant, tucking the child inside his own coat where his body heat might do some good. "You're safe now, both of you." Getting both woman and baby onto Chester required careful maneuvering, but Adam had handled enough emergencies in his years as sheriff to work efficiently even with his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman's breathing was so shallow he had to keep checking to make sure she was still alive, while the baby's cries had settled into a steady whimper that somehow reassured him. His cabin was only 2 miles back along the trail, a journey that had taken him an hour in the deep snow, but which he now covered in half that time, pushing Chester harder than he normally would have dared. Every minute counted when dealing with exposure this severe. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, smoke still rising from the chimney where he'd banked the fire before leaving. Adam had built the place himself 5 years ago, needing somewhere to retreat when the weight of wearing a badge in a lawless territory became too much to bear. It was simple but solid. One large room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows that looked out over the valley below. He kicked open the door and carried his burden straight to the fireplace, laying the woman on the thick bearskin rug as close to the flames as he dared. Her breathing was growing more labored, and her skin had taken on a waxy quality that made his chest tight with worry. The baby was another matter entirely. Once freed from the confines of Adam's coat, the child's cries filled the small space with surprising volume. Whatever had kept this little one alive while his mother nearly froze to death, it spoke to a constitution that Adam couldn't help but admire. First things first, he told himself, falling back on the practical approach that had served him well in crisis situations. He built up the fire until it roared in the grate, then began the delicate process of trying to warm the woman without shocking her system too severely. Doc Morrison had treated enough cases of severe exposure to share his knowledge with the sheriff. Warm gradually, watch for signs of frostbite, and pray that the person's will to live was stronger than winter's desire to claim another victim. As he worked, removing her wet clothes and wrapping her in every blanket he owned, Adam found himself studying the woman's face. She was young, perhaps 25 at most, with fine features that spoke of good breeding despite her obvious recent hardships. Her hands, though ice-cold and chapped, were soft beneath the damage, suggesting a life that hadn't always involved manual labor. But it was her left ring finger that caught his attention, a pale band of skin where a wedding ring had recently been, the flesh slightly indented as if she'd worn it for years before removing it. More mysteries. And as the baby's cries continued to fill the cabin with their urgent demands, Adam realized he'd just invited complications into his carefully ordered life that he couldn't begin to imagine. The question was, would the woman live long enough to provide answers? Dawn arrived gray and cold, filtering through the cabin windows like weak tea. Adam had spent the night in a chair beside the fireplace, dozing fitfully while keeping watch over his unexpected guests. The baby, a boy, he determined during one of the feeding attempts with warm milk diluted from his small supply, had finally settled into an exhausted sleep around 3 in the morning. But it was the woman who commanded most of Adam's attention. For hours, she'd lain still as death except for the barely perceptible rise and fall of her chest. Her breathing had grown stronger as the night progressed, and color had slowly returned to her lips, but she remained locked in whatever unconscious realm the cold had driven her to. Adam had seen men pulled from frozen creeks who'd never awakened, their minds as frozen as their bodies had been. He was adding wood to the fire when he heard it, a soft gasp, followed by a confused murmur. Adam turned to find the woman's eyes fluttering open, unfocused and filled with the disorientation of someone emerging from a nightmare. "Easy," he said quietly, moving to kneel beside her. "You're safe. Both of you." Her eyes, a startling shade of blue, like cornflowers in summer, tracked to his face with obvious effort. When she tried to speak, only a hoarse whisper emerged. "My baby," she managed, the words barely audible. "Where is?" "Right here." Adam gestured to the makeshift cradle he'd fashioned from a wooden crate and blankets near the fire. "Healthy and loud when he's awake. You save his life, ma'am." That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Relief flooded her features, followed immediately by wariness as she took in her surroundings. Adam watched her catalog details, the rustic cabin, the badge on his vest hanging over a nearby chair, the fact that she was wearing his spare long underwear beneath several blankets. "You're a lawman," she said, statement rather than question. "Sheriff Adam Collins, Millfield County." He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "Found you and the little one on the North Trail yesterday. You were nearly gone." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillows. "How long have I been?" "About 14 hours. You've been in and out of consciousness, but this is the first time you've been truly awake." Adam moved to pour water from a pitcher into a tin cup. "You need to drink." Slowly, she accepted his help with obvious reluctance, as if she wasn't accustomed to depending on others. but her hands shook too much to hold the cup steady, forcing her to let him guide it to her lips. "What's your name?" Adam asked as she drank. A long pause. "Catherine," she said finally. "Catherine Miller." The hesitation was slight, but Adam had been questioning people for too many years to miss it. Catherine Miller wasn't her real name, or at least not the whole truth. But he'd learned that pushing too hard, too fast, often sent frightened people deeper into their shells. "Well, Miss Miller, you and your son are welcome to stay here as long as you need to recover. But I have to ask, what were you doing out there? That trail doesn't lead anywhere except deeper into the mountains." Catherine's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I was traveling to Denver. To my sister. The storm came up so fast, and I got turned around in the snow." Another lie, or at least a half-truth. Denver was southeast of here, and the trail where he'd found her led northwest toward the mining camps. But Adam filed the information away without comment. "Where did you start from?" he asked instead. "A settlement called Cedar Ridge. Small place, maybe 2 days' ride from here." This time, Adam was certain she was lying. He knew every settlement within 50 miles of his territory, and there was no Cedar Ridge anywhere in the region. But before he could probe further, the baby began to fuss from his makeshift cradle. Catherine's entire demeanor changed instantly. Despite her obvious weakness, she struggled to sit up, her eyes fixed on the child with fierce maternal protectiveness. "Let me," she whispered urgently. "Please." Adam helped her into a sitting position, then carefully placed the baby in her arms. The transformation was remarkable. Color flooded back into her face, and for the first time since awakening, she looked truly alive. "Hello, sweet boy," she murmured, and the baby immediately quieted at the sound of her voice. "Mama's here. Mama's here." Watching them together, Adam felt something twist in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. There was something achingly beautiful about the picture they made. This fierce young mother and her child, survivors against impossible odds. "He's a fighter," Adam observed. "Kept crying most of the night, but he took the milk I managed to get into him." "Thank you." Catherine's voice was thick with emotion. "You saved us both. I don't know how to repay." "No need for repayment," Adam interrupted. "Any decent person would have done the same." She studied his face as if looking for some ulterior motive, some expectation of payment that she couldn't provide. When she found only sincerity, some of the tension left her shoulders. "Your husband," Adam said carefully. "Is he looking for you?" The change in Catherine was immediate and dramatic. Her face went pale, and her arms tightened protectively around the baby. For a moment, Adam thought she might bolt, despite her obvious physical weakness. "I don't have a husband," she said, the words clipped and final. But Adam had noticed the pale band on her ring finger, and he'd seen the way she'd flinched at the question. Someone was looking for her, and whoever it was, she was afraid of being found. "Catherine," he said gently, "if you're running from something or someone, I can help. That's what sheriffs do." For a moment, he thought she might confide in him. Her blue eyes searched his face, and he could see the war being fought behind them. The desire to trust warring with whatever fear had driven her into the wilderness with nothing but a baby and inadequate clothes. Then the walls came back up, brick by careful brick. "I told you," she said firmly. "I was traveling to Denver when the storm hit. There's nothing more to it than that." Adam nodded, though they both knew he didn't believe her. "Well then, we'd better focus on getting you strong enough to continue your journey. Doc Morrison should probably take a look at you both, make sure there's no lasting damage from the cold." Panic flashed across Catherine's features. "No, no doctors. I'm fine. We're both fine." "Catherine," I said no. The vehemence in her voice startled the baby, who began to cry. Immediately, she softened her tone, rocking the child gently. "I'm sorry. I don't need a doctor. Please." Adam studied her for a long moment, adding this new piece to the growing puzzle. A woman traveling alone with a baby, lying about her destination, afraid of doctors, running from a husband she claimed not to have. Whatever Catherine Miller's story was, it was far more complicated than a simple journey gone wrong. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the cabin windows and reminding them all that winter wasn't finished with the territory yet. But inside, warmed by fire and the growing understanding that they were safe for now, Adam made a decision that would change all their lives. He would give her time, time to trust, time to heal, time to decide whether the refuge he offered was worth the risk of honesty. And maybe, if he was very careful and very patient, he'd learn what had driven this brave, frightened woman into the snow with nothing but love for her child to keep her going. The truth, he suspected, would be worth waiting for. A week passed in the isolated cabin, and with each day, Catherine grew stronger while the walls she'd built around herself grew incrementally thinner. Adam watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, noting how color returned to her cheeks and how her movements became less cautious, more natural. The baby, whom she called Samuel, thrived in the warm environment, his cries growing lusty and demanding. It was during the evening of the 7th day that the first crack appeared in Catherine's carefully constructed facade. Adam had been mending a bridle by lamplight while Catherine nursed Samuel near the fire. The domestic tranquility of the scene struck him as both foreign and deeply appealing. He lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten how peaceful a home could feel with the right people in it. "You're good with him," Catherine said suddenly, her voice soft in the firelit room. "With babies, I mean. Do you have children of your own?" Adam's hands stilled on the leather. "No, never married. Never had the chance for a family." "Why not?" She paused, as if realizing how personal her question had become. "I'm sorry. It's not my business." "It's all right," Adam said, setting aside his work. "This territory doesn't exactly offer a surplus of eligible women, and the ones who are here usually have their pick of men with more promising prospects than a county sheriff." Catherine studied his profile in the dancing firelight. "You seem like a good man. Patient, kind. Those are rare qualities." "Speaking from experience?" The question slipped out before Adam could stop it, and he immediately regretted the intrusion when Catherine's expression shuddered. But then, unexpectedly, she sighed. "Yes, speaking from experience." Samuel had fallen asleep in her arms, his tiny face peaceful and milk-drunk. Catherine adjusted the blanket around him, her movements automatic and tender. My late husband, she corrected carefully, was not a patient man, or kind one." Adam felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Late husband?" Catherine's laugh was bitter. "I suppose that's one way to put it. He's dead to me, anyway. Has been since the night I realized he'd rather see Samuel and me dead than let us leave." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Adam had suspected abuse, but hearing it confirmed made him want to ride out and find this man, regardless of the consequences. "Did he hurt you?" Adam's voice was carefully controlled, but Catherine must have heard the steel beneath it. "Not physically. Nathan was too smart for that. Bruises can be seen, questions get asked, but there are other ways to break a person." She shifted Samuel to her shoulder, the movement allowing her to avoid Adam's eyes. "He controlled everything. Where I went, who I spoke to, what I wore. Said it was because he loved me, because he wanted to protect me from a dangerous world. But you got away." Catherine's smile was sharp-edged. "I stole money from a strongbox and left in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Not exactly the dignified escape of a refined lady, but it served its purpose." "How long were you traveling when the storm hit?" 3 days. I thought I was being careful, staying off main roads, but I got lost when the snow started falling." She finally looked at him, and Adam saw a vulnerability in her blue eyes that hadn't been there before. "If you hadn't found us." "But I did," Adam said firmly. "And you're both safe now." "Are we?" Catherine's voice was barely above a whisper. "Nathan Hartwell isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat. He'll come looking, and when he does..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Adam felt pieces clicking into place. "Hartwell. The name's familiar." Catherine went very still. "You know him?" "Know of him. Railroad money out of Denver, if I'm thinking of the right man. Owns half the territory between here and Colorado Springs." Adam leaned forward in his chair. "Catherine, if you're married to Nathan Hartwell, then your real name isn't Miller." She closed her eyes as if in pain. Catherine Hartwell. Though I'd rather be anyone else in the world. The weight of what she'd told him settled over Adam like a heavy blanket. Nathan Hartwell was one of the most powerful men in the territory, with connections that reached all the way to Washington. If he decided to make trouble for a small county sheriff who'd harbored his runaway wife. But looking at Catherine, really looking at the way she held herself protectively around her child, the haunted quality that lurked behind her eyes, Adam realized he didn't care about the consequences. "He won't find you here," he said simply. Catherine's eyes snapped open. "You don't understand. Nathan has men, resources. He can try." Adam's voice carried the quiet authority that had served him well in his years wearing a badge. "But this is my territory, and these mountains are treacherous for folks who don't know them. If your husband wants to come looking, he's welcome to try." "Why?" Catherine's voice broke slightly. "Why would you risk everything for strangers?" Adam was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire paint shadows on the cabin walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, honest. "Because I've spent 6 years in this job watching strong people get crushed by those with power and money. Because every man deserves the chance to protect something worth protecting." He met her eyes directly. "And because you and Samuel aren't strangers anymore. Haven't been since the moment I carried you in from that storm." Tears tracked down Catherine's cheeks, and for the first time since awakening in his cabin, she looked truly hopeful. "There's something else," she said, her voice stronger now. "Samuel isn't Nathan's son. His father was a young man who worked on my family's ranch before I married Nathan. When Nathan found out," she shuddered, "that's when I knew I had to leave. He said he'd see us both dead before he'd raise another man's bastard." Adam felt the last piece of the puzzle slide into place. This wasn't just about an abusive marriage. It was about a powerful man's wounded pride and a mother's desperate love for her child. "Does this change things?" Catherine asked, watching his face carefully. "Knowing that Samuel and I are even more of a liability than you thought." Adam stood and moved to kneel beside her chair, close enough to see the firelight reflected in her blue eyes. Without speaking, he reached out and gently touched Samuel's small fist where it peeked out from the blanket. "It changes everything," he said quietly, "because now I know exactly what I'm fighting for." Outside, the wind howled through the pines with renewed fury, as if winter itself was making one last stand against the approaching spring. But inside the warm cabin, 3 people who'd found each other in the midst of desperation began to understand that sometimes the most unlikely families were the strongest ones of all. The question that remained was whether love and determination would be enough when Nathan Hartwell's inevitable reckoning finally arrived at their door. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine's confession, and the rhythm of their shared life had settled into something that felt surprisingly natural. Adam would rise before dawn to tend to his duties, riding out to patrol his territory or handle minor disputes in town, while Catherine maintained the cabin and cared for Samuel. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking quietly while the baby slept between them like a bridge connecting their separate sorrows into something resembling hope. It was during one of these peaceful interludes that the reckoning finally came. Adam heard the horses first, multiple riders approaching fast through the pine trees. His hand moved instinctively to his gun belt as he rose from his chair, every instinct screaming danger. "Catherine," he said quietly, not taking his eyes from the window, "take Samuel to the loft. Now." She didn't ask questions. The weeks of living with fear had taught her to trust Adam's judgment without hesitation. Within seconds, she'd scooped up the baby and disappeared up the ladder to the sleeping loft, her footsteps silent on the wooden rungs. 4 men rode into the clearing, their leader a tall, impeccably dressed man whose bearing spoke of wealth and authority. Even in the remote wilderness, Nathan Hartwell looked like he'd stepped from a Denver drawing room. Expensive coat, polished boots, and an air of entitled confidence that made Adam's jaw clench. "Sheriff Collins," Nathan called out, his voice carrying the false joviality of a man accustomed to getting his way through charm before resorting to threats. "Might I have a word?" Adam stepped onto the porch, his badge clearly visible and his hand resting casually near his weapon. "Mr. Hartwell, you're a long way from Denver." "Indeed, but a man will travel any distance to retrieve his stolen property." Nathan's smile was cold, predatory. "I believe you're harboring my wife and child." "I'm harboring a woman who nearly froze to death and the baby she was protecting," Adam replied evenly. "As any Christian man would do." "How noble." Nathan dismounted with fluid grace, his three companions remaining mounted but alert. Adam recognized the type. Hired guns dressed as ranch hands, men who'd kill for the right price. "However, Catherine has clearly filled your head with lies about our marriage. She's unstable, you understand, prone to hysterics and wild accusations. I've come to take her home where she can receive proper care." "Funny thing about that," Adam said, stepping down from the porch to put himself between the men and the cabin door. "The lady in question tells a different story. Says she's a widow, free to make her own choices about where she goes and who she stays with." Nathan's facade cracked slightly, revealing the steel beneath. "Sheriff, I'd advise you not to interfere in matters beyond your jurisdiction. I have friends in territorial government, men who could make things very difficult for a small county sheriff who overreaches his authority." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hartwell?" "Merely a statement of fact." Nathan's hand moved to rest on the silver-headed walking stick he carried, a stick that Adam suspected concealed more than decorative metalwork. "Now, I'll ask once more, where is my wife?" "Your wife is dead." Catherine's voice rang out from the cabin doorway, clear and strong despite the tremor Adam could hear beneath it. She'd changed from the frightened woman he'd first found. Weeks of safety and care had restored not just her physical health, but her courage. "She died the night you told her you'd rather see her child dead than acknowledge him as your own." Nathan's composure finally shattered. His face twisted with rage as he took a threatening step forward. "You ungrateful little—" "That's far enough." Adam's voice cut through the evening air like a blade, and suddenly his Colt was in his hand, though he'd drawn so smoothly that no one had seen the movement. "The lady has made her position clear. Time for you to move along." Nathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. 4 against 1, Sheriff. Not very good odds. Depends on how you count." Adam's smile was thin and dangerous. "See, you're not in Denver anymore, Mr. Hartwell. This is mountain country, and these boys you brought look like city men to me. City men don't know that sound they've been hearing for the past 5 minutes, the one like wind in the trees." Nathan frowned, and in that moment of confusion, Adam whistled sharply. The sound was answered immediately by similar whistles from the surrounding forest. North, south, east, and west. "That would be my deputies," Adam said casually. "I sent word to town when I saw you coming up the trail." Funny thing about mountain acoustics, sound carries a long way on a clear night like this. Nathan's hired guns were looking nervous now, their heads swiveling as they tried to count shadows in the darkening forest. Adam could see doubt creeping into their eyes as they realized their numerical advantage might be an illusion. "You're bluffing," Nathan snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe I am." Adam shrugged. "Feel free to test the theory. But ask yourself this. Is getting one woman back worth the risk of a shootout with a territorial sheriff and his men? How would that look in the Denver papers?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Nathan's eyes darted between Adam, Catherine, and the shadows that might or might not contain armed deputies. Finally, his businessman's pragmatism overcame his wounded pride. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth, remounting his horse with sharp, angry movements. "Yes, it is," Catherine said quietly, stepping fully into view. Samuel was in her arms, and even in the fading light, there was no mistaking the fierce maternal protectiveness in her stance. "I have a witness to your threats, Nathan. A territorial sheriff who can testify that you came armed to his home and threatened violence against a woman and child under his protection. How do you think your railroad friends would react to that scandal?" Nathan's face went white with rage, but he was trapped and he knew it. Without another word, he spurred his horse toward the trail, his men following in sullen silence. Adam didn't holster his weapon until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the distance. Only then did he turn to Catherine, who was sagging against the doorframe as adrenaline left her system. "The whistles," she said weakly. "Were there really deputies out there?" Adam's grin was boyish and slightly embarrassed. "Nope, just me and a lifetime of hunting these mountains. Echoes are funny things up here, if you know how to use them." Catherine stared at him for a moment, then began to laugh. It started as a small chuckle, but grew into full-throated laughter that spoke of relief, gratitude, and something deeper. 6 months later, Sheriff Adam Collins stood in the same clearing, but everything had changed. The simple cabin had been expanded with a proper nursery and a larger kitchen. A vegetable garden flourished beside the house, and chickens pecked contentedly in a fenced yard. Catherine, now Catherine Collins, emerged from the cabin carrying a much larger Samuel, who babbled happily as he reached for the colorful leaves that marked the arrival of autumn. The fear that had haunted her eyes was gone, replaced by the contentment of a woman who'd finally found her home. "He's getting too heavy for this," she said, settling their son on Adam's hip with practiced ease. "Growing like a weed," Adam agreed, tickling Samuel until the boy squealed with delight. "Won't be long before he's wanting to ride Chester." Catherine smiled, standing on her toes to kiss her husband's cheek. "Maybe we should get him a smaller horse to start with." As they stood together in the golden light of late afternoon, watching their son discover the world around him, Adam marveled at how much life could change in a single year. He'd been a man content with solitude, convinced that his rough existence had no room for the gentler things. But sometimes, he reflected, the greatest blessings came disguised as emergencies, and the families worth having were the ones you were brave enough to choose, even when choosing them meant standing against the whole world. Samuel reached out to grab a handful of Adam's hair, laughing when his father pretended to be wounded by the assault. And in that simple moment of domestic happiness, all three of them understood that they had found something worth more than safety or comfort. They had found home.